How do I know what I think until I see what I say?
The Green Notebook, carried by military leaders around the world. Within those pages are sweat, tears, triumphs, and the hard-won lessons of life. Lessons worth sharing. Each week, the team dives into the notebooks of military leaders, business professionals, authors, athletes and coaches, and entertainers to share lessons and help you lead with the best version of yourself.
Today's episode sponsor is Aditon. I got to know the Aditon co-founders, James and JJ, several years ago. They're former Army NCOs who spent years in tech. They know the job firsthand, and they truly listen to service members to learn about today's critical challenges. The Army has always been about the team. Whether in the field, at the motor pool, or wherever they work, troops must collaborate to accomplish their mission. Today, this mission is even more challenging as it extends over wider areas and requires greater information management. Leaders understand that the commander's intent is key to winning in complex environments. And this is where Aditon's flagship product, Muster, spelled M-U-S-T-R, comes into play. Muster is a tool that enables commanders to communicate their intent and connect it with action across a distributed formation. Whether you're preparing for an exercise, supporting sponsorship, or coordinating daily operations, Muster serves as a digital knife hand that simplifies complexity. If you're interested in leveraging Muster or learning about what other units are doing with it, reach out to Aditon. For a limited time, listeners of the From the Green Notebook podcast can try out Muster for free. Visit aditon.io/green notebook to get started. That's aditon.io/green notebook. Welcome to another episode of From the Green Notebook. I'm your host, Joe Byerly, and this week we're diving into the notebook of Anna Papalia. Anna is an expert in interviews and the author of the recently released book, Interviewology, The New Science of Interviewing. At some point, all of us will either interview for a job or be the one hiring someone else. So this is a topic that could literally change the trajectory of your life or someone else's. And that's exactly what happened to Anna, which is why she is so passionate about the art and science of interviewing. In this episode, we discuss the 4 interview tendencies that she has discovered through her research. And that's the charmer, the challenger, the examiner, and the harmonizer. And we talk about how to leverage the strengths that come with each style and how to avoid the pitfalls that each brings, whether you're being interviewed or the hiring manager. And I'll also provide some great tips to help you better prepare for interviews, regardless of your interview style. So grab your green notebooks and please welcome to the show, Anna Papalia.
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Anna. I just finished today your book that I think by the time this interview airs, it'll have just come out. It's your first book, Interviewology, The New Science of Interviewing. And so I told you right before I hit the record button that I realized that I've been doing this wrong now for the last 6-7 years. So I'm really, really glad we're having this conversation today so I can fix it moving forward.
Thank you so much for reading the book.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things that really shines in the book and on all of your social media feeds is your passion for interviewing, the art of the interview, doing it correctly. Where did that come from?
It's interesting. I had an entire career in HR, and then I got out and started consulting to teach people how to interview in 2011. And it wasn't until about a couple of years ago where I put it all together and realized that it came from really a long time ago. I actually escaped a really abusive stepfather when I was 15. I moved out when I was very young. I moved in with my grandparents and I put myself through high school and I got myself into an Ivy League school. They asked me to come in for an admissions interview. And I told them the story that I just told you, that I had to escape this bad situation. And I thought college was really my way out of that previous life. And I was admitted on the spot. And I tell this story in the opening chapter of my book. And it's funny, you do things with such passion. And I really believe that an interview can change your life. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago where I looked back at my own life and I was like, oh, my life changed in an interview. I got admitted to the University of Pennsylvania in that interview. It changed my life. I went on to study psychology, and then I went on to have a career in HR and recruiting, and spent so much time in interviews hiring people, and then also realizing and being responsible for changing other people's lives. And I didn't really put it all together until I sat down to write my book, that this is why I'm so passionate about it. And I'm also passionate about it because we don't give people tools backed in research and science. And that was one of the reasons I left my corporate job, because I thought, this is the most important thing people do, right? Getting a promotion, getting a job, getting into school. Why don't we help people in a better way? And I bought all the books that were out there, and they basically tell you to memorize answers and just tell people what they want to hear. And I thought, that's just lousy advice. Where else would you give someone that advice in life? That's just bad advice. And it set me down a path to collect research and do this in a real meaningful way. So I'm passionate about it because an interview has changed my life personally. And I have been on the other side of the table hiring people. And I can see, and I've seen for so long, that people just didn't have skills or the self-awareness needed to succeed at this.
Okay, there's a couple things that I want to talk about that you just said. One, self-awareness, but first, you mentioned one of the myths to interviewing, which is just go into it and tell people what they want to hear. Why is that so bad?
Well, for a couple reasons. Let's just imagine you have it on really good authority that you know exactly what this hiring manager wants to hear, and you're a very good actor, and you can go in and you can do that. Well, how long are you going to pretend? 3 weeks? 3 months? Hopefully you're going to work at this job for years. And so eventually your real personality will reveal itself. So while it's a temporary good strategy to get your foot in the door and get the job, you eventually will not be happy because you have not advertised yourself correctly. And the hiring manager won't be happy if you pretended to be something that you're not in the interview. So instead of that, I encourage people to be themselves, because it's not about getting any job, it's about getting the right job. And the way to do that is the harder way, is to learn how to show up authentically and be yourself in these situations. Because I think most of the time we find ourselves in bad jobs or companies that aren't good fits for us because we misrepresent ourselves in the interview process. And hiring managers do the same thing as well.
Yeah, I specifically for that particular myth, I think why it struck me, there was a couple years ago, I did an interview and it did not go well at all. And the questions that were asked of me, I did exactly what you're talking about. I remained authentic. And so when I got out of the interview, I was like, man, I should have said this or I should have said that. And then I realized what you just said is that these were the people that I would be working with for a very long time. And so again, that's one of the myths that really stood out to me, because you're right, like your energy level can only hold that persona so long before it just tears you down. And the people you work with, you want to enjoy coming to work every day with them.
Absolutely.
What's one of the other ones, especially like when it comes to preparing? I've heard people say before, I don't want it to seem like it's over rehearsed, or, that like I've over prepared, or, I'm just a robot. Like I want to speak from the heart. I want to speak off the cuff. What about that one?
Oh, I've had many clients come to me over the years and tell me, I don't want to sound too scripted. I want it to feel really natural. And I just always say that is an excuse not to do the hard work. You get better at interviewing the more that you do it and the more you prepare and practice. You don't sound scripted. You actually sound better. The first time someone's asking you tough interview questions should not be in an intimidating boardroom with a bunch of people, especially a panel interview, peppering you with questions. The idea that you tell yourself that you should do it on the spot is absolutely terrible advice. And it's also you telling yourself that so you're getting out of doing the hard work of preparing and practicing. And I think one of the more pervasive myths that I cover in my book is that we all also believe that everyone interviews like us. And that's what led me to discover interview styles. because we all in our hearts and in our souls think that everyone really approaches life like we do, right? And it takes growth and wisdom for us to look around and go, oh, wait, they have a different perspective. And when I discovered interview styles, I realized that it's a lot of the reasons why our wires get crossed in interviews. Some people, prioritize making a connection while others prioritize being respected and heard. And that sets people up for much different experiences.
I want to talk about the 4 types because, again, as we were talking before the interview, when I was reading it, I think I realized that I'm one of these types and I am totally screwing up the interview process when I interview people. But going back, and I'll share something with you. A couple of years ago, I went through something called the Battalion Commander Assessment Program. And basically, they flew all of us to Fort Knox. We stayed in this dark barracks room for a week doing a battery of tests. And at the end of the week, you had that board interview that you're talking about. And so I sat there the entire week thinking of questions. It was really kind of the first time I had sat down and really reflected on what I thought could be some tough questions. And in that moment for me, I realized that I want to do something about it. So I created a book, definitely not as well researched and written as interviewology, but I created a workbook called My Green Notebook with my co-author, Cassie Crosby. And it's a 30-day guided self-reflection that touches on different things that you could be asked in an interview. Like, think about a time you had a conflict at work and how did you manage that? And so that was something I created when I came out of that experience, because I realized that self-awareness is such an important aspect of that process. And it's just important in general. And so I just wanted to kind of try to help, we wanted to try to help people think through these things before they find themselves in the situation, which is going to lead me. That was a really long way for me to ask my next question. But the importance of self-awareness, whether you're the person doing the interview or you're the person getting interviewed.
Mm-hmm. So when I left the corporate world in 2011, I started teaching at Temple's Fox School of Business, and I taught over 600 students every year. So it was like getting a PhD in interviewing. I saw so many students over and over again. And I realized pretty quickly that interviewing in the most basic sense is a set of questions about you. And my students who knew themselves really well, who had a deep well of self-awareness, always did better. And then that led me to realize and have my light bulb moment and discover interview styles. Because I was like, what if I could write a personality assessment that allowed my students to see themselves the way they come across in an interview, what impression you're making, to facilitate that self-awareness in a real, deep, and meaningful way where they felt validated, right? They got their results and they were like, oh my goodness, I didn't know other people did this, or this is totally me in an interview. Whenever you receive, your personality results from Myers-Briggs or StrengthsFinder or even 5 love languages, for example, right? We don't have a formalized language to use to talk about how we interview. And so for me, that was so important when it came to how do we not just help people develop their self-awareness, but then how do we talk about it? I prioritize making a connection. You might prioritize adapting. And what does that mean? And how does this set us up for different experiences? And how do we get people to see us as qualified? When you have a different way about that and you look at things differently, you're going to go about it differently. And your polar opposite may be interviewing you and might not like your approach or your style. And my goal with this book and my project is to get everyone understanding that just because it's a different way to do it doesn't mean that it's wrong or bad, and that we need all different types. And we need this in work, in life. We need variety and diversity of thought.
Yeah, I doing the podcast, I'm all about making a personal connection. I love getting to know the guest on a personal level. And I feel once you have that, the interview, it's just a great interview. But that also translates to work when I'm interviewing people too for jobs. And, I want to get to know them. So that's, I guess, let's go ahead and talk about the different typologies that you discovered in this. Because this is I think the first one is kind of what I realized that I am in this process.
Sure. So there are 4 distinct interview styles, and then each has a variation. So you could essentially be one of 12, right? So the first one is You could be a charmer in interviews. Charmers prioritize making a connection. They're highly accommodating, and charmers look at an interview like a performance, and they are the star of the show. Charmers, more than anyone else, really enjoy interviews. They enjoy interviewing and being interviewed. Then we have challengers. And challengers look at an interview like a cross-examination. They're highly skeptical. They're going to figure something out. And they look at an interview like, it's hard for them not to say everything. And they ask really tough questions. And that's how they show that they're qualified. And they almost interrogate people as job seekers or hiring managers because they really want to get to the bottom of something. And then we also have examiners. Examiners in interviews look at an interview like a test. Their view of it is very binary. They're either going to pass it or fail it. They're either going to be hired or not hired. And it's all about showing how they're qualified. They stick to work. They talk about their qualifications, and they don't really open up and share many details about themselves. And they're the opposite of charmers. So they're not sharing personal stories. They're not making a connection. It's all about work. And they do not go into an interview wanting to be liked. They go into an interview wanting to be seen as qualified. And then lastly, we have harmonizers. Harmonizers go into an interview wanting to adapt. They look at an interview like a tryout for a team that they want to become part of. They're always talking about the department and the group and how they would fit into that. And you can imagine how they are the opposite of challengers. Challengers want to be respected and heard. This is who I am. Take it or leave it. And harmonizers are the opposite of that. They're collaborative and they're warm and they're accepting and they're easygoing and they want everyone to get along. So you see how these four styles really can, like your wires can get crossed, right? If you have a harmonizer and a challenger, for example, or a charmer and an examiner. So it sounds to me like you are self-identifying as a charmer after reading the book.
I think so, because I really just want to make a connection. I like telling stories. I like hearing stories. And one of the funny things you write in there is one of the downsides of that is that I may not even get to the questions I need to be asking in the first place to see if somebody's qualified for the job, or vice versa. I may not even mention my qualifications.
That is absolutely the biggest downfall or negative of charmers. And I can speak from experience because I'm also a charmer. I'm highly accommodating. I'm highly extroverted. As a hiring manager or a job seeker, I want to be liked. I want the candidate to like me. I want them to like me if I'm a candidate. It's really important to me. Charmers use the force of their personality to get what they want. And then in that, we forget to talk about our qualifications. We forget to talk about the projects or our successes or what we've done because we're so focused on making a connection. And this is hard for some positions, right? Imagine if you're in IT or you're an accountant or an actuary and you're a charmer. It's a little different depending on your job, right? So I think it's all about, like we said before, developing your self-awareness, really understanding how you get someone to see you as qualified, and then keeping that in your mind so you can balance it. And I often ask myself, since discovering this and doing this research, what would my opposite do? What would an examiner do? How would they approach this? Because it's the opposite of the way I would.
I want to make a point there. You may have mentioned it early on, but I think, while we're talking about the four types right now, you talk about it in the book, but just because you interview this way doesn't necessarily equate to how you're going to be in the job, correct?
We have to really pull out interview performance and how someone performs in the job, right? So when I wrote this personality assessment, and what we test is how you are in an interview, and then you get your results, obviously. But you may just be this way in interviews. Now, over 80% of people tell us that their results are in line with who they are all the time, but that's not necessarily true. Not everyone has a congruent personality in that way. And it's important to mention that, especially in America, we conduct social interviews and we have a bias towards extroverts. So if you're introverted, you've been given a lot of messages in society that in an interview, you got to turn up the volume and you have to not be this way. So a lot of introverts do that. They sort of pretend to be something that they're not, or they know that they have to be more talkative and open up more, even though that's not naturally who they are. And then as they start working, they kind of turn down that volume because that's not who they are naturally. But it really depends on who you are and the societal messages that you get in your performance in an interview. And how someone performs in an interview has really nothing to do with whether or not they're going to be good at the job. That's the kicker. That's the really unfortunate part here.
As a unit leader, you want your team to look great and feel united, but you don't have the time to deal with the hassle of designing custom apparel, collecting money, making the roster of sizes, and then figuring out where to store everything once it finally comes in. You also don't want to deal with the stress of worrying about the quality of the gear or that it actually arrives on time. Meet X-Ray, a veteran-owned apparel brand elevating the custom gear experience. X-Ray provides free design services and creates dedicated web stores for units. This allows individual members to place and pay for their own orders at any time, with the items being delivered directly to their homes. There are no minimum order sizes or upfront costs involved, and X-Ray produces elevated performance apparel and casual gear on demand right here in America. This means that they are never out of stock and can make any design you can imagine. X-Ray's performance line features designs that are permanently dyed into the fabric. As a result, your unit logos will never fade, crack, or peel. With X-Ray, you and your team will have apparel that meets your high standards, whether you're doing PT, working out in the gym, relaxing at home, or anywhere else you choose to wear it. With a simple form submission, you can open your own unit store and have a hassle-free product line your team members will be proud to wear. Units who launch custom stores with X-Ray automatically get 20% off MSRP, and volume discounts are available for groups that prefer to order larger quantities all at once. X-Ray is made here, made to last, and made by veterans. Launch a custom design with X-Ray today at www.xray.cc. That's EXRAY.cc. As a charmer, what advice would you give me for interviewing, especially, if somebody's asking me about, a past experience or I don't know, like to share a story from my last job?
I would say as a charmer, you're naturally inclined to make that connection and you want to be liked so much. You've got that unlocked. You don't have to worry about that. As charmers, what we have to worry about and work on is adding structure to our stories. Using STAR method is an excellent one to give your stories some direction, because in an interview, every story you share should have a purpose. I'm going to show them how I'm qualified. I'm moving the interview conversation forward. Why am I telling this story? Yeah, I get it. We're trying to make a connection, or I want to make them laugh or get them to like me. But I also need to give them my qualifications and some structure to the story and tell them like what I actually did. And like I was saying before, tap into what an examiner would do. They would talk all about their qualifications and what they've done. And that is just not something that charmers do naturally.
You mentioned the STAR method. Could we break that down a little bit? I wasn't introduced to the STAR method until about like 17, 18 years in the Army, and it's probably something I should have learned much sooner.
It's such a good formula. Basically, so there are 5 different types of interview questions. There's standard interview questions, technical questions, brain teaser questions, and there are behavioral questions. Behavioral questions are these big ones that come often in the middle of the interview, where they ask you something like, tell me about a time you dealt with a tough customer, or tell me about a time that a project didn't go the right way and how did you handle it? Now, that's a big question, right? And if you are responding well, you're telling a story. And STAR method is a way to organize that story, and it stands for situation, task, action, and result, which means explain to me the situation that you were in, the task that was required of you, the action that you proactively took, and then spoiler alert, the result is always how you were the hero, how you turned the customer around, how you saved the company money, how you did something fabulous. You're always the hero at the end of the story. And if you struggle with telling stories, or if you get really nervous in interviews, STAR method is an excellent tool to use when you're prepping your interview answers and thinking about, how do I give these stories meaning and direction?
Again, it's something that I wish I would have learned much sooner in my career, but I'm glad. If you've never been introduced to the STAR method, highly, highly recommend it. Moving on, so as we talk about the different types, as you were describing a challenger, I was like, that's a type of person I would like on my team because I feel like they're going to get to the bottom of it. But that's not necessarily like if you're talking to a charmer and telling them, hey, use the STAR method because you need to have a little bit of structure to yours. What advice would you give to a challenger going into an interview?
So challengers, like I said before, are skeptical. They ask a lot of tough questions. And sometimes challengers need to be encouraged to just kind of like relax a bit, put down the sword. Not everything needs to be peppered to death with a bunch of questions. Challengers need to practice trusting. They need to practice like letting the process unfold. And that's really difficult for them, especially if you are a very successful executive and you pride yourself on figuring things out. This can be really hard in an interview, but you need to know that role in the interview, that they are asking you questions and provide great answers. But challengers also struggle in the sense that they think it's unprofessional not to say every thought that they have and explain everything, so their answers can ramble and go on and on and on and on and on. So they can use STAR to make their answers more concise because they have a risk of losing their audience because they have a tendency to drone on and on and on.
Yeah, one of the things you talk about challengers is like their need to be heard. What is that?
I don't know. I mean, farmers want to be liked, examiners want to get it right, harmonizers want to adapt, and challengers want to be heard. We all have something. We all have our own situations, from childhood, or we've gotten messages, we've received messages from society that tell us that this is the way we think we should be, or we modeled behavior from previous bosses. Who knows? It could be a combination of a lot of things. But I find it very fascinating that some personalities decide that, like, I'm going to be liked. And others are like, I'm going to get this right. And then other people are like, I just want to adapt. And the challengers are like, nope, I want to be heard and respected. It has been honestly one of the most incredibly fascinating aspects of collecting this research and making this discovery, is that I went into this thinking that surely I was going to find one interview style that was better than all the others. And I was certain it was mine because I had been teaching people how to interview for so long. I was absolutely going to figure out that it was me. And luckily, what I discovered is that I was totally wrong. My hypothesis was completely incorrect, that charmers aren't the best at interviewing. That I collected all this research and I realized that all interview styles have the potential to be just as successful. And I tested this on thousands of college students who went on to get internship offers and job offers after graduation. And I realized that if there was one that was better than any of the others, they would have gotten all the offers, and they didn't. It was a nice, normal distribution of the data everywhere. And I thought, well, how wonderful is that? How wonderful was it that I was completely wrong?
Yeah, I'm glad you are too. And I think it goes back to the self-awareness thing that, is a key theme throughout your book. I believe it's either in challengers or examiners. You have a line in there, something about like, a lot of people push back to you talking about they want to be authentic. And you talk about this isn't about not being who you are. It's about being the best authentic version of you in this particular context.
For such a long time, we've been fed really bad advice when it comes to interviewing. And I think some of that comes from the societal dynamics and power dynamics. In the 80s, there were more job seekers than there were positions. Hiring managers had all the power, and you were told, just tell them what they want to hear and be exactly what they want and you'll get hired. And now, especially post-COVID, COVID has changed the talent market in a way where job seekers have more power. And we need interviewing advice that reflects that. And we need to be empowered to go into interviews and be ourselves. And now hiring managers don't have all the power anymore. It's a totally different power dynamic. And now working from home virtually has changed so many aspects of working. So I don't feel as though this idea of pretending to be something that you're not and memorizing these perfect answers, it doesn't work anymore. And it's also terrible advice. It might have worked, 40 years ago, but that's not where our society is going. It's not where work is going.
I want to keep going because now I want to talk a little bit about one of the things that I thought was fascinating was that these styles aren't just for those being interviewed, they are for the hiring managers too. And I want to get into that, but I want to continue with this advice thing. So if I'm an examiner, what advice would you give me going into an interview or what to watch out for?
Well, examiners are very good. They make a very professional impression. They keep it about the facts and the figures and their qualifications, but they can also come across as cold, disinterested, not really prepared. If your answers are really short, and sometimes I've seen this strategy where people are like, I'm just going to go in and give them a 10-second answer. They don't need to know anything else, just this. It can backfire because you haven't opened up. You haven't given them much to go off of. You're making the interviewer's job so much harder because they have to ask you a bunch of follow-up questions and really beg you to open up and answer their questions. So it's a balance between being the charmer who opens up and tells these stories freely, and the examiner needs to tap into that and open up more. I mean, that is my absolute number one advice for examiners is open up more.
And then the last one in there is the harmonizer.
Well, harmonizers, one of their greatest strengths is to adapt. One of their greatest strengths is to look around the room or a company and realize how they could fit in. But one of their biggest challenges is, who am I? What do I want? What could I do here? And an interview is them asking you questions about, why should you work here? Why should we hire you? What are your strengths and weaknesses? And if you are always identifying with the group or the department or a role, you're really going to struggle in an interview. Harmonizers struggle mightily with, who am I? Why should they hire me? Because they're always selling how they're easygoing, how they adapt. I'll fit in whatever you need. I'll do it, right? Much different than a challenger.
I would imagine that would come off maybe fake too. Like, is that something you could smell a mile away in an interview? I guess now that you've been doing this for a while now.
I don't see it as fake. Now I see it as someone's approach. I feel like that's real. Like for harmonizers, that's real. They're not pretending like I want to fit in. Like they truly get joy from being collaborative.
Okay, yeah, let me reframe that. I guess like if I didn't understand the 4 styles and an harmonizer came in, is that how the harmonizer could come off to me?
Well, as a charmer, perhaps. As a challenger, certainly. Challengers are highly skeptical of charm and highly skeptical of people that are collaborative like that. And they're polar opposites, so it really rubs them the wrong way. In the same way that you probably would not like meeting an examiner who their answers are really short and sweet and they don't open up and you have no idea if they liked you or not, which is the personal hell of a charmer because we just want you to like us.
Absolutely.
They're interviewing with someone who doesn't like you. You're like, and we've all been in these situations in job interviews where you're like, man, that person had a poker face. I have no idea if they liked me. They were probably an examiner.
Right.
And your wires just get crossed. So it really is highly dependent on what your baseline is, what's your interview style. That depends on how you're going to get along. If you interview with another charmer, you're going to have a wonderful time. You're going to enjoy yourself just in the same way that a challenger interviewing with another challenger. We like people who speak our same language. It just is the truth. And that is why I wanted to write this book and create these tools because I wanted people to have this language and understand, oh, wait, it's okay that of course I'm going to be in these situations where I feel really comfortable, but then there are going to be other times where it's not wrong. They're not bad. They're not fake. They're just doing it differently. They have a different perspective. And for me, honestly, it took me 12 years to realize this after interviewing quite literally over 10,000 people. And then I had 2 children, and becoming a parent had me open up and realize, wait a minute,
Right.
Perhaps the way I do it isn't the only way to do it.
Right. Yeah, that's one thing that kids will teach you very quickly. So the other side of the coin now, if I'm hiring somebody, you mentioned a charmer interviewing a charmer. I may talk to somebody for 45 minutes and not even get to, the reason we're doing the interview in the first place. So what advice would you give me when interviewing somebody?
I'm sorry, Joe, but you have to add some structure and add some interview questions.
All right, this interview's over.
Charmers are very guilty of, I'm just going to see how I feel and we're going to make a connection. That is not a job interview, Joe. That's a date. A job interview means you need to test them. According to the EEOC, it's a test, which means ask all of your candidates the same questions and don't help them. Let them squirm, let them answer them. It's not about making a connection, because then what you're doing is you're just hiring people that you get along with. You don't know if they have the technical chops to do the job. So this is really hard for a lot of hiring managers to force themselves into a structured approach. It's more scientific. It's not as fun. It's not as sexy. It's not as easy. It's not just a conversation, but it does lead to better results every single time. It's been proven by science. I talk about it in my book. I did a ton of research. There's also another great book called Making the Cut by David Padula about how the hiring process is flawed. And he outlines just how badly we do this when we don't have structured interviews.
Okay, I don't want to talk to you anymore.
Sorry. But you're never going to do it again, see?
All right. And that's what, again, I told you that, like, I read your book after I've done interviews, and I was like, oh man, this is tough. So what about a challenger in the interview process? Because you're talking about challengers. I don't know that I would want to interview with a challenger. So what advice would you give them?
Technically, right, if you were doing it right, you would have a panel interview with a charmer, challenger, examiner, or harmonizer. And then you would have everyone represented, and you'd have all these lovely perspectives, and it would be balanced. Challengers make great hiring managers because they're naturally inquisitive and skeptical. But challengers have a hard time allowing the other people to talk. They have a hard time backing down and asking a question and just letting the person reveal themselves. And hiring managers also have a really hard time listening. So most interviews go like this. Hi, thanks so much for coming in. Really appreciate it. Let me tell you about the company. Let me tell you about the role. Let me tell you about me. Let me tell you about my career. Let me tell you about the team you're going to work on. Let me tell you about all this stuff. They talk for 25 minutes. They don't really ask one question the whole interview. The candidate's sitting there nodding and smiling, and they hire that person. And then in 3 or 6 months, that hiring manager goes to HR and is like, I don't understand. This person can't do this job. You're like, did you ask them any questions in the interview process, or did you just talk at them? Most hiring managers talk 80% of the time. And so what every hiring manager could benefit from is talking only 20% of the time, which is incredibly hard if you're the boss and you're used to talking, because that's not what an interview is. It's not your soapbox. It's not your time to shine. It's your time to ask a question and listen to the candidate's answers.
Okay. As you're talking, I'm like doing an after action review of every time I've interviewed somebody. And thankfully I have actually asked questions and didn't just go on about my career and my stuff. What about examiners?
Examiner hiring managers are, again, very good because they're so precise and they'll ask really great questions. For examiners, it's not as hard for them to stay on task and ask the structured questions, but they also have to realize that people aren't just their resume. They aren't just their qualifications. And if an examiner interviews people like us who are charmers and that person starts telling stories and opening up, they may get annoyed by that. Like, let's stick to work. So they need to soften their approach in that way that a charmer needs to firm it up a bit and stick to work. Examiners really need to know that, be a little bit more empathetic, open your mind up a little bit. People aren't just who they are at work.
I remember one time, again, as I'm reading, I'm like replaying interviews and then putting, these titles on people. And I think I interviewed, an examiner asked me a question and I just kind of like went off. I just told a story. And then I finished and they were like, that's great. You didn't answer blah, 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 blah. And then they moved on to the next thing. It was like a punch in the stomach.
Yep.
I
That's
was
a
like,
challenge examiner, all right.
yeah. And I was like, okay, do I walk away now? Did I just fail this thing? What about harmonizers? How do they come across? And, or I guess like if they're interviewing, what are some things that they need to watch out for?
It's hard not to like harmonizers, and that's by design. Harmonizers are very easygoing and collaborative. And for harmonizers, it's hard for them to hire because they also see the best in almost everyone. So I would say a big takeaway for a hiring manager harmonizer is to know going in what you need. So it's easier for you to be picky because it's really difficult. I've debriefed with harmonizers before. Like, okay, we have these three candidates, A, B, and C. And they're like, well, I think they could all job. And I could, it's like, no. Like one of them is going to be better than the other, right? Harmonizers need to work on knowing what they need and being more choosy for sure.
So, looking at it from the perspective of a hiring manager or looking at it from the perspective of being interviewed, I think goes back to self awareness and this need for it. What are some tools that you've found, maybe like you do personally, or that as you've talked to clients over the years that have helped them with that self awareness?
Well, when it comes to interviewing, I mean, that's why I wrote the personality assessment that I wrote, the interviewology profile that my book is based off of, because there are literally no tools and there's nothing backed in research and science to teach people how to interview, neither job seekers or hiring managers. And I thought, the most important business decisions we make happen in interviews. Yet 90% of hiring managers are never trained to interview. So when I wrote the personality assessment and published it about 6 years ago, I was really proud of that. And not just because it's mine, but it's really one of the only in this arena when it comes to interviewing for a job that gives you insight into the impression that you're making. It's sort of like a mirror. I'm sure it's universal, right? We've all left situations, dates, interviews, meetings, whatever, and thought to yourself, did I come across the way I intended? I know what I was trying in my head, but like, did I make that impression? And it's so validating to get a result of a personality assessment. And, oh, okay, like this is what I prioritize, and this is my approach and style, and these are my strengths and weaknesses. And now I have a baseline to work from, and I know myself authentically, so I can shift kind of from here or there. When you don't really know what your baseline is, you don't really know how much you're shifting. Does it feel authentic? So I hope it gives people a baseline to feel validated in their approach and to do this in a more meaningful way, and gives them a language to talk about why they do what they do in interviews.
Well, if you're listening to this show and you're like, I want to know, you can go to Anna's website at, I think it's interviewology.com, right?
Yep, theinterviewology.com.
Yeah. And there's a link on there that goes to the assessment and you can get that. How long does that take?
It's 20 questions, takes the average user about 6 to 8 minutes. We have one for job seekers, one for hiring managers, and it produces a 40-page interviewology profile that walks you through everything you're doing right and wrong in interviews. And that's all based on you, on the results of your assessment. And then my upcoming book outlines all 4 interview styles. So you can learn about all the styles in the book.
And again, I think even if you don't take the test, you read interviewology, you cannot help but start having flashbacks of either times you've interviewed people or times you've been interviewed in the book. And you can, at least for me, I think I was able to quickly identify, with being a charmer. And then I didn't really pay attention to the positive aspects of it. I was like more looking at all the negative stuff that I'd done. So I thought the book itself was a great tool.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I think it's also important, and I struggle with this as well, to balance that self awareness with also patting yourself on the back and knowing that charmers do things really well. And of course, we all have things that we need to work on. And I worked really hard in the book and in my research to show a balanced approach that each style has its strengths and weaknesses. In the book, I call them overused strengths. We all have things that we can work on, but there are also things that we should take pride in and be happy about. And it's like who we are. You're not going to change. Your eye color is not going to change. Your hair color is not going to change, right? Like it's embedded in who you are. This is based on your personality, not just like how much you want the job or how prepared you are. It's important to know that going into the interview.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for your time today. If listeners of this show want to learn more about you, or they're asking like, is she on Instagram? Where can they find you?
I have a big social media presence. I'm on everything: TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, you name it. So please follow me there and come to my website, theinterviewology.com, and you can pre-order my book on Amazon or any of your preferred retailers.
Well, Anna, again, thank you so much for your time. This was awesome.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of From the Green Notebook podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and the opportunity to help more people on their leadership journey. Also, make sure you check out our website at www.fromthegreennotebook.com. There, you can listen to past episodes, read leadership articles written by military leaders from around the world. You can sign up for our monthly reading list email where you can learn about new books that are coming out, and our Sunday reflection email that comes out every Sunday morning. Is really short. It's a 2-minute read, but I guarantee you it's going to start your week off on the right foot. Finally, make sure you follow us on Twitter at FTGN Notebook, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for From the Green Notebook. Again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. I am humbled by the opportunity to learn these lessons alongside you. So please join us next week for another episode of From the Green Notebook, where we're going to help you lead with the best version of yourself.
I came from the mud. There's